This episode of Hellbent for Horror is brought to you by Patreon supporters and listeners like you. If you enjoy Hellbent for Horror, please consider supporting the show by contributing either on our Patreon site or via PayPal. You can find links to both of those on hellbentforhorror.com. And I thank you for helping to sustain the show. Hi, and welcome to Hellbent for Horror, a podcast devoted to all things related to horror. I'm S.A. Bradley, and I'm a lifelong movie lover, but my heart belongs to horror. My biggest thrill, however, is getting to talk to people about this stuff. I really want to start conversations with you. The eternal battle between good versus evil, it's possibly the oldest story theme we have. It works because it's simple and it's effective. And if you had to distill horror down to one general theme, it would probably be this: good versus evil. Either good wins in the end and order's restored, or evil wins, and it's a cautionary tale. And that means that there are usually good guys and bad guys, white hat, black hat, or at least innocent victims and an evil monster. Now that simplicity can be quite comforting. That black and white makes it easy to feel victory when the monster dies. However, today I want to talk about some movies that want to upset that simple apple cart. Ones that throw doubt into the mix. Ones that sour that victory when the monster dies. They make you question your preconceived notions. They make you nervous, especially when the monster's a human being. So what we're going to talk about is the sympathetic monster in movies. And to talk about this today, I'm happy to have J. Blake Fichera back as a guest on the podcast. Now, J. Blake is the author of the Rondo-nominated book, Scored to Death, Conversations with Some of Horror's Greatest Composers. He's also a producer and editor of television and films, as well as a musician who has been inducted into the New York Blues Hall of Fame. J. Blake also co-hosts a film podcast called Saturday Night Movie Sleepovers. Blake, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, I have to say, I just caught your guest appearance on the Wrong Reel podcast about John Carpenter. That was a hell of a lot of fun.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun to do.
No doubt. So before we jump into the subject today, can you tell people about your podcast, Saturday Night Movie Sleepovers?
Sure. Saturday Night Movie Sleepovers is, as we describe, a nostalgic movie podcast. It's kind of snark-free, and my co-host, Dion Baya, and I explore one movie every episode, and we tend to focus a lot on the movies from our childhood and kind of teenage years, so 80s and 90s, but we do a lot of stuff from the 70s as well, and we've even branched out, especially when it comes to horror in October, when it comes up to Halloween, to older films like the Hammer Mummy film or Peter Lorre's Mad Love with Peter Lorre from the 30s.
Yeah.
But we have a good time. Deanna and I have been friends for 20 years, this year. And so I think that's kind of the secret sauce of the show is kind of our rapport and the history we have and the love for movies that we share. And so we have a good time. We try to keep it light and hopefully funny, but not in kind of a snarky way that's like some movie podcasts are.
Right. I really like the style. And like you said, the rapport that you two guys have is really obvious and really strong. And another thing that I really like about your show, and what I think is going to dovetail well into this somewhat esoteric thing that we're going to try and talk about today, is that you realize that the proprietary piece of your show, as well as my show, is not just technical knowledge. It's really the heart of how you feel about movies, your own personal experience or remembrances that you have. And that's probably going to help on this kind of sense thing that we're going to go on here. Before we get to that, though, you were a guest on here before to talk about your book, Scored to Death. But for those who might have missed it, can you give a brief overview? Because it's a really great idea for a book.
It's a collection of 14 interviews with some of the horror genre's most respected or best composers. So we interviewed John Carpenter. I interviewed Harry Manfredini, who did Friday the 13th and House movies. Charles Bernstein, who did Nightmare on Elm Street and Cujo and The Entity. Christopher Young, who did Hellraiser and Drag Me to Hell and Sinister. So it's a collection of 14 of these guys. Some of the Italian guys, like guys from Goblin and Fabio Frizzi, who did Lucio Fulci's movies. Some young guys, or younger guys, like Joseph Fichera, who's known for the Insidious films and the Conjuring films. And more than even being about music and horror movies, it's a lot about just the process of composing music for film in general. But it's also a lot about how music works in horror films, anecdotes about specific films, and hopefully to everybody else, because they were to me, really interesting and fascinating conversations with creative people.
Oh, they certainly were. There were several that I thought were great. In fact, I think one of the people from your book, we have one of his movies that he scored showcased in the show today.
We do. One of my favorite scores, actually.
Yeah, isn't it? It's great. So we're keeping it a mystery for everybody, but if they stick around, they'll be able to hear what it is. So let's talk about the idea of the sympathetic monster. Let's see if we can dive on into this. It's a term that I think when we were talking about doing a show together again, you had mentioned sympathetic monster to me, and I immediately knew what you meant, even though I'm not necessarily sure how easy it is to come up with a definition for it. I almost feel that it's easier to just give an example, and like the most obvious one would be Norman Bates from Psycho. You know, how you feel about Norman at the beginning of the movie versus where you feel he is at the end of the movie, where your allegiances go, and how you feel about that is kind of what I think is the quintessential sympathetic monster. Why do you think that there's such a thing as a sympathetic monster?
Well, first I think that given just the term sympathetic monster, one could automatically go to something like Frankenstein's monster.
Right.
But in terms of what we're discussing is more of kind of a human element. To me, I've always found them really interesting, and that's why I kind of brought it up. And several of the movies we're doing today are some of my all-time favorite films. And I think kind of what interests me about it, and what was interesting about watching them in preparation for this was I was trying to think, because I experienced all of these films, the ones that I'm referring to, kind of around the same time in my life. I was in film school, so they were all in like my late teens and early 20s. And I was trying to think if I had seen anything other than Psycho that kind of fit this definition before that, and wondering if like that's why these made such a big impact on me, because maybe I had never seen anything like it. I think what's really interesting is that you take the perspective, which is a very real perspective, is that these people, although they're killers and they could be considered monsters, but they are people. And so everybody has, redeeming qualities and flaws. And I think what I find really interesting is not only the sympathy that we feel for them, but also the empathy as viewers that we feel for them.
Do you think that's the purpose of a sympathetic monster, to get empathy or to relate or to make you think that it could be you?
I think so. I mean, I think that especially, when we look at a historical figure like Hitler, I mean, he's automatically kind of dismissed as this monster, and we never really think about him in any other terms. But at the end of the day, the cliche is like even Hitler loved dogs, but
Hitler was a great dancer.
He was a person, and it's hard for history and us to think of him in any other way. So I think when we're confronted with it in kind of fictional form or a dramatization form, maybe based on a true story, but watching it in film, it's kind of forces us as viewers to kind of think about the character, but also think about ourselves and how close are we to that character. Like where's the line? What events could have happened to us that would very easily have pushed us over that line to do what these characters do.
I think for me, it's kind of like a massaging of that shadow self, because what it does, the reason at least for me, the reason I get uneasy is that it places doubt. If I was 100% sure of my convictions at all given times, I wouldn't have any doubt. But the idea that I get a little bit in there is really interesting. That empathizing can happen. It makes you think twice. Now, with that said, I'm not saying that I can, just because these monsters are sympathetic, doesn't mean that there's condoning or justification of anything that we're going to talk about today. But at the same time, we get this glimpse of that human in there. And I think feeling sympathy for a monster, it is a fine line. It isn't universal. Like, I sympathize with Norman Bates, but I don't sympathize with the Firefly family and Rob Zombie in the Rob Zombie movies. But Norman, he's insane, and he has this compulsion. And I think if there's one thing that I saw in all the movies that we're going to watch or that we're going to talk about, it's that everybody has a certain compulsion, an illness that is almost beyond their ability to stop.
You know, when we get to talk about these films, and I think there's go-to like critical examination terms that I think become, like I said, like the go-to thing, and I don't know if they're always true. Like I might have, like, for instance, just on a completely like kind of different note, but as an example, when I was on the Wrong Reel podcast and we were talking about John Carpenter's The Thing, and you know, the go-to reason why that movie didn't do so good was because E.T. came out like 2 weeks before. Right.
I applauded you for actually going down that route, because it drives me nuts when I watch Carpenter sit there and talk about E.T. and I'm like, oh, come on. I was in the theater in 1982, dude. I was there with my dad.
There's like these go-to things that we say or we read, and then we kind of regurgitate just on kind of faith that whoever said it first is right. And I don't know if that's always the case. Like, for instance, I don't know if we want to reveal some of the movies that we're talking about, but just yet. But you know, there's one of the films we're talking about is a lot about voyeurism, and there's all this talk about like it makes the audience uncomfortable, but makes the audience the voyeur. And you know, it's hard for me to put into perspective what audiences of that time period really would have thought, but it finds me I find it very hard to believe that like that's why the reaction that film got, like that's the reason. I don't know. It seems like a far stretch to be like, that's like the blanket reason. Like, it makes the audience the voyeur. It's like, well, the audience is always the voyeur.
Right. But let's go back in time to probably a movie that's a first in many different ways. It has a whole bunch of firsts to it. It's probably the first serial killer movie that I know of. It's also probably, it is the first sound movie by Fritz Lang, and it's the first major role for Peter Lorre as well. It's M, 1931, and the movie takes place in the Berlin that's after the war. So we have World War I, we're in the Weimar Republic, and that's where Fritz Lang makes all his money. He is a fantastic silent film director. The problem is Weimar's coming to an end by the time that M is coming out. We're not yet at the Nazi Party having any kind of power, but I think that there is this energy that comes through in M of a place that's kind of dying. At that point, that area of Berlin, that area of Germany was falling apart at the seams. And then you have this maniac who comes out. So when did you first see M, or do you want to give a little bit of a synopsis of what the movie's about?
I think I probably first saw it in class when I was in film school. Always kind of fond of Peter Lorre, and he gives kind of a real heavy dynamite performance, especially at the end of this movie. Mm-hmm. There's like you said, it's Berlin, and there's a child serial killer on the loose. The police can't seem to catch him, and so really kind of tightening their grip on the city in an effort to catch him. They end up also tightening their kind of grip on the other criminals that are just kind of there to make a buck. And so the criminals themselves, I think partly because they want the police to stop messing with them, and partly because of their own moral code, decide to take it upon themselves to kind of band together and catch the killer themselves, and then try him in their own court of justice.
Yeah, a good court of justice as well. Yeah, it's really interesting to me. Peter Lorre is amazing in this film, to say the least, but he is not a constant through the movie. He is in the beginning. There's a little piece of him in the middle. And then, of course, there's this wonderful half hour or so where he's just in every second of it, and it's really, really freaky. It's really interesting. I can't help but think about how cool Fritz Lang was for making this movie the way that he made it. There were so many directors that died as soon as sound came in with that big honking microphone, and the cameras were immense, and he couldn't move around. What he did is, I think a third of this film was done silent, and then the other 2/3 were with sound. But I mean, talk about some advanced stuff. I mean, the very idea of how we learn about our killer, it was really, I think, started in this movie. So you have whistling. That's one of the key parts. So he's jumping right in on sound. But not only that, the first time the guy's whistling, you don't see him on screen. And then the second time he's whistling, it's from behind. So you don't see his lips. He's just writing a letter to, I think, the newspaper at that point. And I was going, man, that's pretty advanced shit for a guy who's just learning some stuff on this microphone. And you get so much that is done visually as well as audio. There's a ton of exposition that happens in interesting ways. Like the little kids have that eeny, meeny, miny, mo that's really about the murderer. And so you get to find out just how grotesque the murders are, that they're chopped up into mincemeat and stuff like that without ever having to see it. And I was just like, wow, that's really, really interesting stuff. But because our killer is only in small snippets, Lang is making us focus on the people. And I think that's where this movie, why that final sequence of the kangaroo court that you're talking about matters so much, because we get to see everybody just betray each other. When these kids start to disappear, they start slandering each other. They start seeing problems around every corner. And I thought that was really smart of Fritz Lang to do, where it was the guy can hide in plain sight because we're all suspects when we're in that kind of emotional situation.
Yeah, it really is kind of very progressive in his filmmaking of the film, the use of sound. It's really an interesting film, especially for the time period, but even now, the kind of stuff you're talking about with the surrounding people of the town and stuff kind of reminds me of the Boston Strangler a little bit. The way they portray like the paranoia of the city. This is all stuff that we later see a lot of, but I'm not sure that a lot of that was being done in the late 20s and early 30s in cinema. It's kind of the birthplace of a lot of these kind of techniques and motifs. The other thing that kind of makes this film stand out, especially in the group of movies that we're talking about, is we're not really asked to sympathize with Peter Lorre's character until the end of the movie. And it takes a brilliantly written, or at least translated, because I don't speak German, monologue performed by Peter Lorre in such a powerful way that I think that most people that know Peter Lorre for the majority of his American film work would really be shocked at how talented and what a great actor he is in this movie.
Yeah, and I think before this, all he did was comedies. He did bit parts in comedies.
Yeah, it's just to take a step back and talk about this idea of a musical motif, a theme.
Mm-hmm.
This is like perhaps Fritz Lang's best use of sound in this film. Not only does it let the audience know that the killer is around because he's whistling in the Hall of the Mountain King by Grieg, but it's also what is how he gets caught. It becomes a plot device in the film itself. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right, but it's like leitmotif or leitmotif, which is
leitmotif. I think it's leitmotif.
Yeah, it comes from the opera, and it's funny because the first time I had ever heard that term was in my book. Harry Manfredini talks about that. And so it's also, in a way, this is kind of the first use of it. It becomes a very big thing in horror later. The kinds of the famous like Friday the 13th, like yeah, or even the dun, for Michael Myers walking around.
Yeah, right.
So it was interesting to kind of, obviously it's more of a diegetic use of sound as opposed to non-diegetic use. It's not like background music. It's actually music within the context of the movie, but it's really kind of fascinating because that becomes not only in film, but especially in horror, such a very important kind of part of the scoring process later.
Oh, yeah. It's interesting that this movie almost feels like it gives birth to a couple different genres or styles, things that are going to become rather common use. Like he starts the movie in complete darkness. It's black for the first 6 seconds. And then there's this weird gong sound. And then there's no music. And instead of that, it's silence and that whistle. So that whistle becomes very pronounced. It really cuts right through. And the idea of having people lean forward because of silence, especially in the time when I'm sure producers are like, hey, we just spent this amount of money on a microphone. I want sound. I wanted to hear the sound of people eating carrots in the background, for him to actually have that much silence and pause in there is great. I really thought it was interesting how he gives you no reason to sympathize with this guy until the very end. When he's getting chased, it was kind of like how I felt when I watched Norman Bates cleaning up the hotel after Marion Crane's dead, or when he's trying to push the car into the bog and the hood stays up. There's this feeling of real anxiety when Peter Lorre's character Beckert is hiding or trying to hide. It really becomes frightening. And there's a lot of horror movie motifs in the people who are chasing after him. You see people lined up in a weird symmetry down the street, how no matter where he goes, there's going to be another person who's crossing the line. And it becomes really, really frightening. We empathize with the terror of being trapped, even though he's done these horrible things. And I think to bring that up is kind of interesting at that time period.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, we aren't, we haven't been outrightly asked to sympathize with him yet. But yet, as a viewer, I think you're right. We do his panic. You're right, like his being trapped and stuff. It's something that I think we identify with on even maybe a subconscious level as a viewer, and do kind of fear for him, not of him, in those moments.
Yeah. It's interesting how at that time period, it was just so much more progressive or mature, if you want to say it, because Paul Muni in Scarface, they need to show him blubbering and crying at the end. He can be as mean as he wants, but he has to cry and beg for his life so that he's seen as a coward, so that we don't empathize with him, we mock him. He becomes a joke. But here, Lang could have made that shot, a few of those shots, especially like when he's hiding in that closet or whatever it was, a storage container, and you don't see the crowd, but you hear the crowd coming, and he's just crouched down in there. That is made for us to empathize with the character as opposed to mock him or go, he's right over there, he's right over there.
His speech to the crowd to this court at the end is all about the compulsion you kind of were talking about earlier.
Right.
It's all about how like he can't help himself. Like he's telling them like, you don't understand what it's like, and like how much I hate myself for it, and how I don't even know I'm doing it at the time. I don't even know I did it until I hear about it. Very powerful. And then what's interesting is, we cut to sections of the crowd, and we see like some people like nodding, like almost sympathetic, or at least definitely empathetic of kind of his plight in this instance. But this idea of this compulsion, he's completely out of control. It's like it's almost like a werewolf.
Right.
Like the Incredible Hulk, he has lapses in time where this stuff happens, and he can't help it.
He can't get away from himself. He's tracking himself down, and he also mentions that he can't escape the ghosts of the mothers and the children. So there's this idea that he is tortured through all this, and the way that Peter Lorre brings this off, it's very believable. It could have been a really straightforward sequence He could have just been strung up, or the police could have been there way beforehand, or there's a whole bunch of ors that could have happened. But instead, we get this standoff that goes probably 5 minutes.
Yeah,
and,
at least.
Yeah, and we flip back and forth, through all of the different emotions that maybe people were having around capital punishment at that time, or people getting away with murder, whatever it might be. It's just really interesting that he did that at that time, and it makes for a very, very remarkable film to come back to. I'm really glad. I haven't seen it in decades. I haven't watched it in a long time.
Yeah, I haven't seen it in a while either. It was fun to revisit a lot of these films, actually.
Yeah. Now this one, the next one, I'm sure that you probably revisit every so often, because if I remember correctly, you did a show about George Romero somewhere else, and you had mentioned that Martin is it your favorite or second favorite of Romero's films?
It's my favorite of Romero's films for sure. Yeah. It's funny when this is maybe last October, I did for Wrong Grill, we did a kind of a Romero retrospective, and I watched this film, but I hadn't seen this film for a long time before that, but this was another film that I saw in school. We actually did watch this film in a class called Genres of Effect that was about comedy and horror, but I had seen it like 1 or 2 years before that, and just absolutely fell in love with it because of this idea of the sympathetic and empathetic or empathic character, killer.
So for those that may not have seen Martin yet, you want to give him a quick synopsis since it's your favorite film?
Martin is about a young male in his 20s who is sent to kind of this rundown factory or coal or steel town outside of Pittsburgh to live with his cousin Kuda, who's an older gentleman. And the whole thing is that Martin's entire family, including him, believe that he's a vampire and that he's like 84 years old. Mm-hmm. And Martin is a serial killer that preys on primarily women in the film. But instead of fangs and kind of supernatural, he uses razor blades and drugs the women. And so he's a serial killer in a much traditional sense, but much more traditional sense. But he's plagued with this thought of that he's a vampire, and that apparently his family believes it as well. When we talked about the film in class, there was this idea raised as like, is he really a vampire or is he just a troubled guy? And it's funny because when they brought that up, like it never occurred to me in a million years that he was really a vampire. Like, right. It was just not something that ever really occurred to me. And I know that Romero doesn't see it that way, but even before I knew that, I always just read it that he's this troubled kid. That again has this weird compulsion to do this, but because of superstition and this weird family lore that's been drilled into him his entire life. And also, Romero points out, because there are these flashbacks that are in black and white that take on a much more gothic, traditional vampire view. And Romero's view on that is that he's a horror movie fan. And so these memories are actually not of himself, but of kind of a culmination of these monster movies that he's seen throughout his lifetime, that he's kind of made his own memories.
It's really interesting that you say that. So for the record, this one floats between second and third for me. It's now at number 2 after watching it again. I haven't seen it in a while. Every time I watch this movie, I just fall in love with it again, because it's probably the most mature idea that I think he really pushes from beginning to end, that just feels very organic, that outside of Night, which is still my favorite. There's something about Night that's just, it's lightning in a bottle. But this, like M, it has, well, first off, I think one of the big things is I'm an old Pennsylvania boy myself. I'm from the other side, though. I'm on the Philadelphia side. But I laughed when I heard you just say cousin. You said cousin. So you're probably from the Philly area as well.
I am originally from Philadelphia. Yeah.
Okay, there we go. As soon as I heard cousin, I went, oh, this is going to be a great conversation. We can talk about the state store and stuff like that. But it really hit home, this movie, because it reminded me of my upbringing in the 70s, where infrastructure was just coming down around everybody's ears, and the industries were falling through. Where I was, it was coal. It was a little bit up north, but that whole thing is like M, that is in Martin. It takes place in a place where the infrastructure is crumbling. People are angry. The better days of Pittsburgh and the suburbs are gone. These people have also had their best times past. The people who are left are like bikers who are throwing beer cans in people's backyards. So there's this weird thing about romance. I see that there's a heavy romance and tragedy, like a gothic vampire movie, a gothic romance that's in this movie, because they're either pining for the old ways, and those old ways can be the faith, or they're pining for the early days, like if he is a vampire, he's pining for the early days of vampiric seduction, or he's pining for the way the city used to be. But it's about the struggles of keeping up with this changing world, or becoming obsolete, or being endangered by people who won't change their ways. If you look at Tata Kuda, I mean, both Martin Kuda, they're getting something out of this relationship. They're in this house driving each other crazy. And Martin, I guess for Kuda, it's like him thinking Martin is a Nosferatu is kind of supporting his old faith. And even, I think, halfway through the movie, meets George Romero as a progressive priest, and he hates the way that this priest thinks, because the priest is kind of making fun out of exorcisms. So he's not even getting what he wants for his beliefs from the new priest. So he's kind of supporting his own faith. Martin, on the other hand, he gets to fantasize. He has this terrible life. His parents are dead. He comes to this know-nothing town, and he's basically trapped in a room. So the fantasizing about being special is kind of in there. And you mentioned about whether he's a vampire or a human. I thought about that too. I think he's human, obviously. But if Martin's a human, he gets to fantasize about a world where he's strong and in control instead of, bullied and impotent. If Martin's a Nosferatu, he's thinks that what he does is absolutely natural, and he's just kind of thinks that human beings are crazy. They get an idea that magic's real, and it's just nuts. But I thought about how these two guys are just constantly in this weird battle in a family way, let alone, a quasi supernatural way. It reminded me, like, have you ever seen Grey Gardens?
Yes.
This is like the vampire Grey Gardens. These people are having this fucking argument. It's been going on for decades. And they get nowhere with it. But I love how there's this whole feeling of the loneliness and the curse, this idea that the place is winding down, he's winding down. And yet Romero does some really dynamic shit in this movie. Like the opening sequence is great. And, I'm sure Romero knows his vampire lore enough that, him, the train, him coming into town by train is kind of like the boat that Nosferatu comes across in, where he ends up killing that woman. But that's an amazing sequence.
It really is. Yeah. Yeah. Because it definitely does. Like, it's all about kind of this juxtaposition of the fantasy of being a vampire, and then like the reality is, like, she comes out of the bathroom, she like flushes the toilet, she comes out, she's got goop all over her face, and she's going to bed, and it's like all of a sudden, we are kind of, as a viewer, slapped in the face with the reality of the situation, and not like this romanticized film version of how this could be going down, which kind of get like alluded to in kind of flashback sequences that Martin's having as he's doing it. It's completely horrifying and brutal for an opening sequence. I mean, it really puts you as a viewer in a place instantly of uneasiness that you only get to revisit a few times throughout the movie, really. But you are kind of like I said, like slapped in the face with it right up front to be like, okay, like this is the ride I'm on.
Right.
And I guess this is, it's too late to get off. So I'm just going to go through it.
Yeah, there's something, one of the reasons that it's so disturbing is how long it takes. It's probably a 5-minute sequence from the time that he is going down the hall and gets into that room until she finally falls asleep from the drugs that he injects into her. And the whole thing of her, I thought about how frightening that whole idea is. You're sitting there and somebody's telling you it's going to be okay, but they just injected something into you and you don't know what it is. And she's like, what did you do to me? What did you do to me? And she's slowly starting to lose it. But there's also this disturbing sexual piece to it. And that really gets to me every time, where there's this weird, and another movie that we're going to look at as well talks about using external ways to get to that internal sexuality that people have, where he's ripping her vein open with a razor blade and letting it drip all over him. And he's drinking it, and he has to get naked. It's not just, oh, and I'm drinking her blood. He has to get naked. He has to lay with her. And that's so, instead of it just being repulsive, which it is, it's tragic. I can't think how lonely that is. And that always hits me in this movie, that there's this great loneliness. If he is the Count, if he's in the midst of this fixation and it's all a fantasy, that's really sad. If he is this 84-year-old vampire and life is just winding down in this nowhere place, where at one point he was in castles chasing people in a gothic way, I can't think of a lonelier thing than being the undead and not being able to die and spending your time with dead bodies.
Yeah. Well, the whole entire film is kind of about loneliness. I mean, he's lonely. Kind of the voice of reason in the house is his, other cousin, Christina, who is Kuda's like granddaughter or something, and who's living there. She's got a boyfriend played by Tom Savini named Arthur, but I mean, ultimately she's lonely and she's kind of only with him to get out of the town. Everybody that Martin meets, Martin has kind of a brief affair in a non-vampiric way with a housewife who's lonely. And then even some of the people that he preys on, which is like another housewife who's having an affair. So clearly she's lonely. I mean, the whole movie is just full of people that are kind of lost and lonely. And we're just kind of, following Martin through this landscape of loneliness. And, it's a film that, I don't know, since the first time I saw it, just really kind of spoke to me in a way that I'm not even sure I really understand, other than that we all feel lonely, at times. And this idea of this young boy, and I think the revelation when I was on the Wrong Reel podcast is I probably saw this around the same time that I was the same age as Martin in the film, which may have played into it as well. And you're right in this, like the idea of this town falling apart behind him. I think it's also an interesting thing. The people that stay, you always wonder, like, why do people stick around?
Right.
It's like when a factory town or a mill town closes and the work's gone, like, why don't they just leave and go where there's work? But I think there's also this element of they're just going to perpetually wait for it to start up again. So in a weird way, and kind of a pun of, Romeroism, like they're kind of the living dead in this town, just kind of walking, waiting for something that's never going to come.
And there's this weird pleading about that as well. Like, it's not just that they're Catholics. They're in a Catholic church that burnt down. And they're just, their church's services are in like some cubbyhole somewhere. And you can see the burnt out church, and the priest is making this entreaty of, don't forget your faith. Don't let go of your faith. Don't let it drop because of this. If you have anything around your house that you're not using, you can sell it and you can bring it in to do this. And so you have that kind of thing. And then you have the other side of it, which is Kuda and Arthur in the pub at one point, or in the bar. And Arthur's saying, I'm getting out of here. I got to get out of here. I'm an auto mechanic and I can't work on cars here. I need to get a better job. And Kuda basically goes, go and take everybody else that's like you with you. And then he turns to the people who are in the bar, who are all drunk and unhappy. And he goes, if they don't want to be here, they can leave. And they cheer. It really did hit home for me because I came from that kind of background. And it felt very real.
I just find it his most interesting movie. I mean, it seems to be, it's like just a more personal story than a lot of his other work. Everything else is kind of on a much bigger, what's happening is much bigger. It's much bigger than just what's happening to a kid. You have like the world is ending around you in the dead films and the crazies. And, even in Knight Riders, it's like the whole troupe of the Knight Riders is kind of at stake, and this way of life that they've established for themselves as this traveling troupe of Renaissance players is at stake. The stakes in a way are a lot less, which I think for me is maybe more accessible.
I agree. There's a scene in the movie that is the second big action sequence, which is, you alluded to it, where a woman is having an affair, and Martin doesn't realize that she's having an affair, so he thinks he's going to find her alone because the husband has left. And there's this great, what makes this scene so good is that it's not big and yet it's huge. Because they are constantly moving, and there are different ideas that are happening. There are different things that are complicating the scene that are really simple, like he injects one person with a needle full of the drug, but he doesn't get the other. And then he runs into another room, and then he's using a phone to keep them from calling out. And then the guy who is hit with drugs is sliding around, and he's able to get him outside. There's this whole thing that's happening in an enclosed space. So they're inside of a house. It's not a mall. It's not in the middle of a field. They're in this very weird angular house between like 3 or 4 different rooms. And there's so much energy in that sequence. I watch it in awe every time that I go, wow, this is super low budget. And one thing that I would say about earlier Romero is that he was great at editing, but not necessarily camera movement. In here, there was some really interesting screen direction, real interesting camera movements inside of that room, or inside of that house. And I think that there's something about the energy that's in that scene in a very banal situation. And I think that's why I really like Martin. There is this really bizarre central idea, but it could happen in my neighborhood. Everything in there could just happen.
And it makes it terrifying. I mean, those scenes, we're used to as a viewer seeing in movies. There are certain conventions, certain motifs that are done in movies, and we kind of accept those as true because they're in every movie. Like, hold the person on the line for, you need to keep them on the line so we can track down the call. Like, that's not true. Like, that's not how it really works. But that's how we see it in movies, with the medical examiner, doing an autopsy, taking out the bullet and dropping it tink into like a little tin thing. Like, that's not true. And this is, we've come to like cinematic language has trained us to think that like the instant you're injected with something, you're going to pass out.
Right.
Whereas in this movie, like it takes forever for the drug to go to like make it through their system so that they actually pass out. In the instance of the first guy, like he didn't have the measurement proper because he was planning for a much lighter person. So this like, it's like almost like the trial and error in that instance. And then just the fact that they don't pass out right away. It takes has to make their way through it. And the thinking of like the horrifying nature of being that person. You don't know what you're injected with. Right. You don't know what's going to happen to you when you pass out. And that's like something that's a constant with those, like what did you inject me with? What was that? Like, what are you going to do to me? And it's terrifying. Like there's nothing about it that's not absolutely terrifying.
And I think that says a lot about Martin, that scene, because for most of the movie, he can like barely deliver groceries, but he's in this situation. He's out thinking to panicking people.
Running around.
He's running around the house. He's rolling up on them. He's like a spider with his little stinger. He goes in, bap, bap, and he runs out. You feel that like he could be an 84-year-old vampire in his element.
And that one instant, like when he barges in on them, there's just like this realism to it where the guy doesn't know who he is.
Right.
And he's like, hey, yeah, like it's, there's nothing, like we can work this out kind of thing. And she's like, no, I don't know who this guy is.
Right.
And like, he doesn't understand that. He thinks it's her husband or whoever he thinks it is. But she's like, no, like, I don't know him. It's like, it's just really great moments that add realism to this movie that are like that. And then the kind of the love story is tragic. Like Martin's one real attempt to be quote unquote normal, have the sexy stuff without the blood. His choice in mate, unfortunately, is his downfall. This woman who's even more of a lost cause than he is. There's big spoiler alert. So if you haven't watched this movie, skip this part. But
right.
Kuda's one rule is like, don't kill anybody in town. And then this woman kills herself by slitting her wrists in the bathtub, and Kuda automatically thinks that Martin did it. And that's the real tragedy of the situation. Is like the one woman he wasn't going to do that to, the one woman that he was able to have some kind of connection with. She kills herself, and then it ends up leading to him being staked through the heart.
Right. This is also something that I saw as a pattern with the movies that we're going to be talking about, and it dovetails into the next one, which is you have these guys that are believing something that they were told by family, and they are doing what they're doing because of that weird belief. It's a compulsion in its own way. And then they find someone who just might be able to save them, and it still doesn't work. And that brings me to Peeping Tom, 1960, the movie that you were alluding to in the very beginning, directed by Michael Powell, a movie that was so reviled when it first came out in 1960, even though that was the same year as Psycho, that it destroyed Michael Powell's career. And the only way he ever got any accolades for it was after Martin Scorsese saved it from obscurity, I think in the late 70s or early 80s. But this is the notorious Peeping Tom that I heard about long before I saw it. The scoptophilia, the morbid urge to gaze, is basically what Peeping Tom means. This is a movie that I think is very interesting that it comes out at the same time that Psycho does. And I heard what you said about the idea of this making people upset because they were being made into voyeurs. And of course, they've always been voyeurs. I mean, Psycho is all about voyeurism as well. Where Hitchcock made a living tweaking the voyeur in the audience. He allowed them to be the armchair observers. Michael Powell just kills that. He basically just says, you are just as incriminated, and I'm going to fetishize this. So as much as Hitchcock is a fetishist in his own way in voyeurism, I think that Michael Powell really takes it far. But what I'll say about why I think my own feelings about why this movie destroyed him is that they didn't even get it over here, I don't think, until much later. I think it died, crashed, and burned in Britain. He was one of the golden boys of the British film industry. And I think he was beloved, and he made these wonderful movies like Black Narcissus and The Red Shoes. They were the jewel in the crown that became international successes. And I think that the critics were outraged that he would put such trash out there. And I think he was assassinated because of what his reputation was. I think he was ahead of his time. I think he was on the same wave that Hitchcock was, but he was the wrong messenger. Whereas Hitchcock in America, he was able to get away with it. But for some reason, that very provincial British film industry really hated the fact that one of the Archers did this. And they really just kind of nailed him. Now, with that said, it is a perverse film. It's a pretty, shall we say, exploitive film.
Sure.
But I think that to just say that it's because it made us into voyeurs is just maybe just touching it a little bit. I think Carl Boehm looks a lot like Peter Lorre in this film.
It sounds like him at times, too.
Yeah. I talked a little bit about the movie Peeping Tom. When did you see it, or what are your thoughts on it?
I saw this in class when I was in film school. I have to guess that it was that horror comedy class that I was talking about. We watched a 16 millimeter print of it, and it just kind of rocked my world. I don't think I had ever seen anything quite like it. You're right, and actually came out a few months before Psycho premiered, actually. And so there's a lot of people make connections in that it's a very Freudian movie about peeping Tom who kills women and stuff like that. So there's a lot of parallels to make between Psycho and Peeping Tom. And for a long time, especially in my youth, having the pretentiousness that comes with youth, there was a long time where I was like, I was pro Peeping Tom, like screw Psycho.
Really?
Because I had taken sides. It wasn't until years later when I was like, there's no reason not to love both because they're both amazing. It's a fascinating study. I don't know if I buy into everything that it's saying, but it's a really interesting exploration of this kid whose father is a psychiatrist or doing some kind of study.
He's a biologist.
A biologist, but studying the effects of fear, especially in children. And so he runs his child through all these crazy experiments of of fear, like putting lizards on his bed when he's sleeping and kind of filming the kid's entire life and all the ups and arguably ups, but mostly the downs, it seems, of this kid's childhood and how that affects him, and it makes him kind of play out those experiments in his own kind of perverse way of the unobtainable quest to film fear, and the repression that comes with that existence. And it really was ahead of its time, I think. It's the backlash from critics. I think you're right about why, but the things they said about it are, it's like they were personally offended. It was like Michael Powell slapped their babies and pushed their elderly mothers downstairs or something. It was like the only proper way to dispose of this film is to wash it down the sewer, but then even then the stench will remain. It's crazy.
I know they were really vicious. It's reminiscent of what happened with John Carpenter in The Thing, where he's not only getting zapped by the critics, which might be expected, but Starlog basically said he wasn't fit to direct traffic. I mean, the fans actually hit him that hard for that movie, and it's hard to believe that happened as well. But I can say that for both movies, there's some reason for people to be a little bit upset. I mean, the movie is basically about a guy named Mark. He's a focus puller for a movie by day, and he's a serial killer by night. And he is, as you mentioned, taking photos all the time. He is shooting film all the time. There's this idea of obsession. There's this idea of compulsion. He is compulsory about holding onto his camera. He won't take it off. In fact, around this strap around his neck, it's a camera that I think his father had given him. But whereas Psycho, it's all kind of a whodunit that's a little bit perverse. Yeah. He kind of massages us a little bit, and he lets us peep through a peephole in the wall and all that. By the end of the credits, you know exactly everything that you're going to know about this character. You know who the killer is. You know what he's doing. You know he's getting off on the footage. And the movie starts with an eye opening, looking right at you. So it's all about watching and being watched. And I think everybody in this movie is a voyeur. They're watching each other. The blind mother is listening. So there's this constant surveillance that's going on, and it's pretty sordid. Although there's no blood, you have this kind of thing about sex rolling all the way through this, the difference between tactile sex and visual sex, where he does peep shows, or does not peep shows, but photos, pinup girl photos at the top of this newspaper agency. And I always like that guy that comes in and goes, "Do you have some views?" And so I think for proper British, this whole thing of the idea of violence and sex, there's no maybes. There's no looking at the knife being a phallic symbol in Psycho. This is, real. This is, I am attached. In fact, there are moments when he's talking about how he needs to photograph. One of my favorite sequences in the movie is when he's upstairs doing the peeps, and he's bored. He's just a a very good professional at making these photos, and he's listening to the model that he knows, and she's talking about her boyfriends and all of this, and he's tediously tapping his fingers, trying to get the light correct. He is completely detached. And then there's this model who's brand new, and she is in profile against the window. And when she turns, she has this disfigured lip. And she's like, can you hide the lip? And he stops taking pictures and he pulls out his movie camera, and it's so fetishized. He's so excited. And he's going, this is like my first time too. And he rolls out of the frame, getting the pic camera right up against her face. And I'm like, he's going right at it. You know, there's the symbolism of sex and fear and all of those things kind of rolling together. I could see how that could make 1960s British folks a little bit nervous.
Well, yeah, I mean, the British are kind of notoriously kind of repressed. At least that's the stereotype of it. And so that idea of the elderly gentleman, you know, wanting to look at the views under the guise of of getting a newspaper is both adds some kind of comedy to the film, but I think also is letting audiences know, like, this is the environment that this film is being shown in at the same time. It's and you're right, he finds this girl named Helen that lives in the house that he kind of is renting out rooms for, and she seems to be possibly his salvation, but she's unable to save him. And of course, you know, in a very thematic, cinematic way, or just dramatic in the terms of drama as storytelling, not as a genre or something, but like the one person that can see him for real is the one person who can't see.
Right.
You know, it's like the wisest person is always the homeless person in the movie, you know. She's the one that can see him for who he is and for the problem that he has, and she's just like, find help, Mark, or we're gonna leave. You know, like, you can't have her if you don't find help. But even though it's now a bit kind of cliche to have a character like that, it totally works for me as a viewer in this instance.
Oh, yeah. And a lot of that has to do with how Powell shoots this. There's a lot of really cool little asides, little reaction shots that he puts in the movie. He actually has a heartbeat at one point when she's grabbing onto his hand.
Yeah.
She's like, were you running? And it's, you know, he's obviously aroused by what's going on inside the room, the excitement of maybe getting caught or meeting this woman for the first time, or her being blind somehow makes him attracted to her. These little asides that he does, or when she sneaks into his, the blind mother sneaks into his projection room and she can't see what's on the screen, but she wants him to tell her what's on that screen. And the way that we find out about her is that she bangs into something in the dark, and there's just this naked white light that Mark puts on her. And there's a lot of that kind of, you know, it's in fact, there's an entire sequence in the movie that is the movie within the movie that could be seen as a little bit of Powell's earlier films, a little bit of a dance number that's involved. There's jazz. There's a lot of bright colors. Sure. What I thought was really interesting about that sequence is that he turns things that were wondrous and dreamy in his other movies, like Red Shoes, and he makes it dangerous. He makes it foreboding. He has those colors and everything just close in on the character. So there is a sense of menace to everything that everybody's looking at as well. And I love that, at one point, the girl who may be his salvation, it's her 21st birthday. She's flirting with him. She asks to come up to his room. She brings him cake. And she wants, as a present, once she finds out that he takes pictures or he's a movie guy, she wants to watch one of his movies, and he puts one of the movies of his father's that he took.
He almost put something else on.
Yes, he almost put something else on. Once again, that little innuendo. What's going on here? You know, there's always just this little perversion going through the movie. But so he puts that on. But even though this is somewhat tame, she's like, what an odd thing for your father to film. And he goes, should I shut it off? And she goes, no. Yeah. And that is like really interesting. The movie is always saying about this shock, but we need to watch, and she needs to watch. And where the movie goes, I don't want to give away things, but we talked about it a little bit, which is he wants to photograph fear. And there are a bunch of prostitutes that are dying around the neighborhood. And he has films of which he watches. So you get the general idea, but what he decides to do to try and get that fearful look, I don't know if it necessarily would be real, but poetically, it's really disturbing.
Yeah. Well, that's what I mean. There's things about it that I don't know if I totally buy, but in the context of being a viewer in a movie, I'm totally really willing to roll with, and they're effective. And he works in the film industry. He's making this quote unquote documentary. I mean, I think it's also a lot about just filmmaking and the kind of the power of the director, and even the, Powell, almost all of these movies seem to have a little bit of which is interesting, cameos.
Right.
By their directors. Romero plays the young priest. In Peeping Tom, Powell plays Mark's father in the home movies, and
the horrible dad who even plays with the focus ring at one point.
and the young Mark is played by his son, Michael Powell's son. It's a really interesting study of even with just reading about it, and reading up on the film and reading about Leo Marx, who wrote the film. I mean, he's a fascinating character.
Yeah, code breaker, right?
He was a code breaker in the war, and this idea of the subconscious or the mind being the ultimate code to crack, and is what kind of drives this story for him as a writer. Everything about it is fascinating.
Yeah, it's an amazing movie, and he is a very sympathetic killer, even though he murders people before the credits are even over. And it's really the acting, and it's the way that the movie is shot. You get his point of view a lot. You get this really stilted way of, like you mentioned, how it's always about film, and it is. And I think that's a fascinating thing, that there's this mixture between the two, because when his mother dies and he gets his father marries a woman 6 weeks after, and he goes, instead of saying after her death, he says the previous episode or something like that. The previous sequence, that's what he says. So he's talking in film terms. And I think he knows he's going to die. I think he is expecting to see this death happen to him. He's expecting to get caught. In fact, when the police are brought in to a murder investigation on the studio lot, he's happy because he gets to take pictures of an investigation. He never thought he'd see this side of it. Yeah. And towards the end, he's like, has this feeling of, this is the only way that this documentary, which is really my life, can go down. There's only one way. And when he says, I'm afraid and I'm happy.
Yeah. Well, clearly, I mean, he's even talks about how he's played this scenario out in like his mind, and he's set up, he's ready for it. It's not just like he's expecting it. He's prepared.
So I do feel that it was one of those movies that while I was watching it, I felt worried for him, even though he was a killer. And I think that says something for the way that it's staged, and just how good Carl Boehm does in making this character really almost, he's killing people, right? And yet somehow he seems passive. Everything else, he's barely a person.
And innocent in a weird way.
Yeah.
And his performance is not what one would stereotypically think of as like a great performance. I mean, it's a little stilted or something. I mean, but it works. I mean, but it's like, it's the right performance, even though, he's not like a method, right. And he's certainly, he's not giving the kind of performances that we're used to seeing now, but, one could even argue that he's not good in the movie, but at the same time, it's the right performance for this film.
And what I want to do now is move on to the next movie that we've got. And it's an interesting one to me. It's a Maniac from 1980. And why I find William Lustig's movie so interesting is it's really interesting to see how some of the movies that came out when I was a teenager, how they're received now and how they're loved by the next generation. You know, most people of a certain age, they discover these movies in bulk, which is great.
Sure.
But some of the context of what people thought of them when they came out, that's kind of lost. And I will say that William Lustig's Maniac is one of those that as time has gone by, people were able to see what was there as opposed to what happened when it first came out. When I was a teenager, it was unrated. It had that really lurid movie poster. And they had a marketing stunt in New York. I think it never got past New York City. But it's where they kind of shot themselves in the foot. They had a little marquee outside of the theater and a coming soon thing that showed all the gory scenes, just people, women getting scalped and stuff, to see if that would bring people in. But what ended up happening was there was this backlash of that's all the movie is. So it was considered like the worst of the worst. That was the low mark of, that's really considered like the worst of the slasher movies. When it came out, it was like, what will people do for a buck? It was considered hateful to women. It was the one that was considered soulless. I think Siskel and Ebert panned it twice. They couldn't just let it alone once. They had to go at it twice. But what the irony is that Maniac is one of the few slashers that actually makes a social comment about something. It's the one where the killer is not someone that, they worry about the closet sadists coming out to see these slasher movies. There's not a closet sadist that wants to be this guy. I mean, this guy is wounded and pathetic and unstable. He's haunted by what he does. He's not empowered at all. And that's the legacy that is really interesting that people have caught on to for the movie Maniac, let alone the gore, which is copious.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that this really isn't even a slasher movie in the traditional sense. I mean, it just happened to come out in 1980, after Halloween, around the time of Friday the 13th. I mean, it was part of that wave, but it's really not a slasher movie. I mean,
right.
It's a horror movie, yes. It's a thriller, yes. It's a drama, even. It's, again, like Martin, it suffers from certain low-budget aspects, and I think things being dated, and
right.
It's by no means a perfect movie, but it's a very interesting and for me, a very powerful movie.
Yeah.
And it's... it's a New York movie for sure.
Very much. Yeah, very much.
And it's interesting to have always seen Joe Spinell in like every movie, to see him play one, like a lead, and two, this crazy killer is also kind of a joy, in a morbid sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because this is a sympathetic killer that for a while, you're not sure what you think. I felt pity for him in several scenes. The movie starts like a standard slasher film. I mean, you got these two people on the beach and they're murdered, and it's really, he picks the guy up and garrotes him and stuff like that. But then he wakes up screaming. And it's the first time you see the face of this guy. He's screaming. He's sweaty. He has a shrine to his mother. We don't know what that's all about. He's got scars all over his chest. We don't know what that's all about. He's got mannequins all over the place. And then it goes to him heading downtown to try and get a little bit lucky. And there's just this, instead of it being what a normal slasher film would be, he goes up there, he just kills her. There's this real world-weary sadness. He has this thing in the room with the prostitute that goes on. He doesn't want her naked. He wants to hug her. He wants her to pose for him. They have a little bit of a tender, I wouldn't call it tender, but there's a conversation that isn't like what you would expect in a movie like this, or from what Lustig was doing before, which I think he was doing softcore porn. And then all of a sudden, because this has been somewhat building slowly and it has this sadness to it, the strangulation comes in a flash, and it seems like a surprise to everybody, including our killer. And he gets up and he's in this trance and he pukes in the bathroom and he's like, oh my God, what have I done? And then just when it seems like he's in full remorse mode, he scalps her. And by then I'm like going, what the fuck am I watching?
Yeah. I mean, It's a little bit of a weird roller coaster of kind of bizarre circumstances. It's kind of for a lack of being able to really describe it. I mean, this was really Joe Spinell's kind of baby. He really he did a lot of research on serial killers, and he co-wrote the script. And so we see kind of him portraying various real life serial killers in a way, at least his own interpretation of, because like the guy that takes the Caroline Monroe character out on a date is not the same guy that we see in the beginning of the movie. I mean, but in that instance, he's showing like kind of like the Ted Bundy, like charming serial killer. It's more of like trying to explore the various kinds of serial killers instead of really focusing on one specific character, but trying to make kind of a hybrid to kind of explore all different kinds of personalities and stuff. So it's a little uneven in that way, or at least unbalanced, I should say, in that way. But it's not something that ever takes me out of the film as a viewer.
Right. I actually saw that as a plus. To me, that was a sign of that compulsion. Once again, it seems like he finds someone that we initially think he might kill, and it seems like she might be a saving grace. When he goes to different places with her, he seems as if he's able to actually interact, whereas it didn't seem like he could do any kind of interaction outside of hacking somebody up when he's at that modeling party and things like that. But he reminded me when he went out to dinner with Caroline Monroe, like Mr. Dallaride from Michael Mann's Manhunter.
Yeah.
There's this whole thing of like, I could be okay. Oh, wait a second. You know what? I don't feel that itch. I don't know what it is about this person. It's balm in Gilead. She's giving me something that I didn't know I needed. And the voices are gone. I'm not hearing Mom's voice. Sure. And so when he loses it again, it makes it all that much more tragic to me. Yeah. And then when we find out what those burns are, and we get this idea of, this is where it's a little bit like Peeping Tom, where you have this idea of him being an artist and she's a photographer, and they get into this conversation about why do you take pictures of women? He says that I think you take pictures to preserve them. Beauty's already in the model. Things change, people die. You can only keep them in a picture, a painting, and that's it. But she says, hey, you can't possess anybody forever, man. That just doesn't happen. But it's an interesting character study. And I'm not sure quite what to think of the end. When you mentioned this movie, I wanted to find out what you think the end's all about.
A couple of things about the movie itself. I can see that somebody would find the way the exposition of his character is kind of told to the audience as being clunky. But for me, I love that it's not really flashbacks, for instance. It's him in these childlike states, and you are understanding sometimes just being told by him in these kind of delusional states what's happening, like hiding in the closet and don't leave me, and these guys pay to have you, but they don't love you. I love you. And the cigarette burns on his chest and stuff like that. For me, especially as a young person seeing it for the first time, an aspiring filmmaker, I found all these things like really like a really interesting way of kind of telling the story. And also a lot of that, and I think a lot of that sympathy that we have for this monster comes from Jay Chataway's score. In a way, it's which is what we alluded to at the beginning of the podcast, which is I interviewed Jay for my book because I love this score so much. Yeah, I really wanted to have him be a part of the book, because for me, maybe more than any other composer working in horror films, especially at that time, Jay manages to kind of inject this heart, this sentimentality, this emotion into these scores. Yes, there are the stereotypical suspense hits, the crashes, the things that make us jump, or the ominous drones and stuff like that. But Frank Zito, the Joe Spinell character's theme is this very beautiful, like flute recorder melody with a backing that's slightly warped, which is that character. I mean, he's like this, you know, we like this, you know, like we sympathize for him, but we know that his background is kind of warped. And so it's that score where he's, you know, he's window shopping, you know, he's walking through the city and gazing at mannequins, the music that plays over that. I think this is this film's a perfect example of how powerful the music can be to kind of reinforce a character or what the filmmakers want us to feel about that character. And that's one of the things that I really connect with and love about this movie. As for the end, I can only imagine that it becomes very unrealistic, surrealistic very quickly, even before he gets back to his apartment. The film has a very gritty realism for the vast majority of it, that dirty New York streets, you know, the subway stations, the graffiti filled bathrooms. There's this gritty realism to much of the movie, aside from his kind of delusional moments where he's kind of talking to us, the viewer, but really talking to himself or his mother when he's combing the hair, you know, oh, you got blood in your hair.
Right.
And stuff like that, or he's sitting on the bed and he's just like, you know, relating this monologue of, but they don't love you, I love you, and, you know, these fancy girls in their fancy dresses. And so, I mean, it gets kind of, you know, brought into his world a little more than that gritty reality. But then the end, like the minute they hit a cemetery, it's like fog.
Right,
you know,
right.
It becomes, all of a sudden, it does become like this. It enters another world, and I think the only real way to kind of read it, for me anyway, is that he's losing it. I mean, we're kind of spiraling into madness with him through his point of view, and it becomes this augmented reality, or this kind of, like, you know, like not reality anymore. And then the ultimate end is clearly, for me anyway, this delusion of madness, of guilt, maybe, of who knows what, in terms of, you know, the ultimate, you know, his demise.
Yeah, I kind of felt, because we had that wonderful moment where he's at the restaurant and everything. It seems like everything is working well, as long as he's around Caroline Monroe. And then he takes her to Mom's grave. And it's like, I want you to meet my mom. You know, oh, Mom doesn't like you. It becomes like the compulsion just takes over right then and there. And he nearly kills her, and she attacks him and gets away. And from then on, the movie is just like in Crazy Town. It is as if it's taken over, and the madness is coming. He's broken whatever line that he thought he would never break. And it's a very interesting movie, and it's a very disturbing film at the end of the day. What I really like about it is Spinell. I think that he is just a presence that, and something so unique. It's not the kind of guy that you ever see lead a movie. And it adds something to that very New York feel, to that film. Yeah. So we're in one New York movie. We'll go to another New York movie, and we're going into one where, as we talked about Maniac and a few of these others, we get a little bit of a point of view of the killer, but we're seeing things externally as well. We're starting to really get deeper and deeper into narrative, and this is a very famous movie. What more can be said about Taxi Driver, right? It's the New York Gothic. It's Scorsese calls it his horror movie. Schrader calls it a mixture of Psycho and The Searchers. But I wanted to talk about personal impressions about this movie, because I was alive. I was, 10 years old when Taxi Driver came out, and I saw the response to that film, and I knew what people thought of New York at that time, and the fear that there was around this movie and what was happening in the streets. I was wondering about your personal impressions about this movie, because it is a very disturbing psycho movie, but people related more with Travis Bickle than they empathized.
Yeah. I will also add that it's one of the few movies that we're doing where the title doesn't begin with M.
Right. I know.
Oddly enough.
Weird.
It was interesting revisiting it now because I honestly probably haven't seen this movie since I was 16 or 17. Wow. I grew up my most formative years were in the 90s, and so this was I was the exact right age to be influenced by that kind of early to mid 90s independent film boom with guys like Quentin Tarantino. And so the idea of getting into kind of these crime films was a big deal for adolescent males at that time that were into movies. And so Scorsese was a logical next step after getting into things like Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction. Mm-hmm. And so I watched a lot. I was very into Scorsese at that time. I'm trying to think of what I felt about it then. You know, it's hard. I feel like, at least for me, I can't speak for everybody, but I would imagine that it's this way for at least some people. It's hard when you're young to separate how you really feel about something from what you're supposed to feel about it. I think, at least for me, I look back and I feel like there was a lot of movies I liked because I was supposed to like, and I don't know if I necessarily really liked them at that time. I was too young to kind of know the difference, I think. So it's really hard for me to think back and think, like, did I really like this movie, or did I like this movie because it was supposedly so great?
Well, it's interesting that you should bring that up. Because for me, it was a forbidden fruit for a while. I was 10 years old when it came out, but I knew so much of the dialogue because, I mean, it was a time period where you had movies like Death Wish, Michael Winner's Death Wish, where there was somebody who was doing something that should be horrifying, but people were going, well, when you're pushed to a certain degree, you're going to, maybe do this kind of thing. So I remember people wearing T-shirts with the Mohawk Travis Bickle on it. Mm-hmm. And I remember people, if you start a sentence going, listen, you fuckers, you screwheads, people will repeat every piece of that line. They'll remember that dialogue part and parcel. And yet this is a character who is completely isolated and he's a walking contradiction. And, he wants to get healthy, but he drinks all the time and takes pills. He's not smart, and he is vengeful when him not being smart gets taken advantage of in some way by other people. Taxi Driver is in this weird world in and of itself. There are very few movies that are like this. There's a TV show that was very much like it, which was Breaking Bad, which I thought was a horror show. By episode 5, I said, this is really a horror movie. The idea that you hit on the common frustration and angst that people are feeling, and you make a character who goes against that, and then you have that bite the person back. And the thing that's interesting about Taxi Driver is that most people don't see the end as tragic. And they don't see it as scary. They don't catch that glint in his eye when he's in the taxi and he takes Betsy wherever she needs to go, that he's still out there rolling around, and he's not a healthy man still.
Yeah, he's a ticking time bomb. He's just waiting to go off again.
Yeah, and he's not sleeping. So I brought that one up. I know that there wasn't going to be a lot that we could say about it, but I felt that it was important to talk about how we empathize with some of these killers, but then if they align, the dangerous people can align with us, and we'll follow along until they cross over a line. And Breaking Bad, having how many seasons it had, it really played with that line. And it was interesting to hear people, as time went on, justifying what this monstrous character was doing until they couldn't justify it anymore. And then it was like this huge, dreadful letdown. And Taxi Driver does that in an hour and 45 minutes or something like that.
Yeah, I can say that just by sheer fact that it's a completely unique movie, that I do know that when I saw it when I was a teenager, that I definitely was aware that I had never seen a movie like this before. And even the score is unlike And the use of music in this movie is kind of unlike any other movie. It's definitely, when you picked it, I thought it was an interesting choice because I was like, do I personally ever really empathize or sympathize with this character? And I don't know. There's a question. Even watching it now, like I'm not sure if I do, or I'm not sure if I don't.
Right.
He's it's another interesting character study, but not in a totally different way than Peeping Tom and Maniac. I mean, in Peeping Tom, it's very much explained in scientific terms, kind of. In Maniac, we're given a lot of information to kind of form our opinion on the Joe Spinell character. In this one, we're like not given a whole lot to go on. So we only really have what's occurring in the, like at the time of the movie, at the present of the movie, to kind of inform how we feel about him. And I think to mixed results as a viewer,
Yeah, and I think that mixed results, one of the reasons for that is that there's two different types of narratives that are happening in this film. There is the narrative part, which is his narration, which is how he sees the world. And we're seeing him at night in this very almost expressionistic, surrealistic New York City with lights constantly flashing, this weird blur that's going on. That's him seeing stuff. That's internal. And then we see the outside. And it's him just standing there next to somebody and kind of staring at somebody else. Or he's just sitting there in his cab, drinking soda, looking through a window at somebody. Or he is watching TV and he's pushing the TV stand further and further with his boot. We're getting this thing of, we see the internal when it's his narration. That's the crazy. And then on the outside, nobody knows that he's about to explode. He's just kind of standing there. And so we have those two things that are happening whenever he's in the taxi diner and he's talking to everybody, and he's almost saying that he needs help. You can almost sympathize with the fact that he can't sleep, and you hope he can get help. And then you see the guy standing in front of the mirror going, "Are you talking to me?" Yeah. And in that way, it's kind of terrifying to me. What was terrifying to me was how much people admired that character at that time. It was really, really bizarre.
Well, yeah, it's, it's a couple of things. It's not dissimilar to the Michael Douglas character in Falling Down, which we did on the Saturday Night Movie Sleepovers podcast last summer. In that, because I hadn't seen that movie since it was maybe a new release at the video store. And my friends always really loved it and stuff, but I hadn't seen it in a long time. And when I was watching it, and everybody remembers like him going into the fast food place and being like, "Do you see something wrong with this burger?" It doesn't look like, he was, I think at the time, people very much identified with his plight, and he was kind of a hero. But then watching it last summer, a little less than a year ago, in much different circumstances, much different time period, I was like, I find it really interesting how much people did kind of identify with this guy or make him a hero or something.
Right.
Because
I'm the bad guy?
But there isn't a lot of redeeming qualities about that character when you watch that movie now. It's not, it's very similar to Taxi Driver in that way. The other thing we try to do on our podcast is, I think, because it's very important for people. I mean, because there's obviously a whole two waves of new film lovers, younger than me, and you're a bit older than me. So we try to always put things in the context of time of when it came out. And so I think it's very hard to understand, especially me. I live in Hell's Kitchen now. So,
right.
But it's very different New York City than it was. Even, 20 years ago when I lived right outside of New York City and I started coming to New York City, it was very different than it is right now, which now it's like the polar opposite of what it was in the 70s. So I think it's important for viewers that are unaware of that context to realize that the mid 70s, you had the whole financial crisis of New York, and New York was just about to go kind of bankrupt, and there was that big newspaper headline that was like Ford to City, drop dead. There was this idea of like New York was going to go down the tubes and the government was just going to let it die. It was a very different climate, and so New York was a very different place than it is now. And really film is the only way you can really view it in that state anymore. But if you don't realize just like how bad it was, the fact that that Travis Bickle will drive anywhere, and they talk about how dangerous those parts of town are. It's yes, you get that inclination from the dialogue in the movie, but you don't really get, like you were saying, you were old enough to know like what the thoughts, what people thought about New York City and what the kind of that was back then.
That's Berlin and M. Berlin and M, Pittsburgh and Martin.
Yeah, it's important for, I think, viewers to really understand what the city was like then, to maybe have even a chance of fully understanding how it could give birth to a character like Travis Bickle. The thing I find really interesting about this movie, because this is something that came much later, is I find watching this movie in juxtaposition to another Paul Schrader script, Rolling Thunder. Was just a year later, also about a vet, a military vet. That one very specifically Vietnam. Here, Vietnam's never really mentioned, but he gets discharged in like 1973. Travis Bickle does. So it's and Rolling Thunder is very much like a vigilante revenge movie about this Vietnam vet who was tortured in a POW camp, comes back, tries to reassimilate and whatnot, and can't. They're two really interesting movies to watch together, given that they're both kind of spawned from the same mind and somewhat similar subject matter.
Yeah, they're both of those movies are really surprising in how heavy duty they can come off. There's some pretty crazy violent moments in that. And one of the reasons that I brought up Taxi Driver as well was to really get to the last movie I want to talk about, because it's kind of like the stepsister of Taxi Driver. It's Monster from 2003, directed by Patty Jenkins, who is the director of the new Wonder Woman movie that's just opening now.
Yes.
And this is a movie that becomes more of a horror movie the more the movie tries to give the character human qualities and touching scenes, because it's all told in narration. It's all from Eileen Wuornos's POV. This is what she thought in her head. This is how she's justifying things. And that is really, really scary to me, because it's a true story. And I remember when it happened, it was huge news, and having a female serial killer was a big deal. But this is really an interesting movie, because kind of like the moments that are narration in Clockwork Orange, you've got this story being told by a narcissist killer. This is what had to happen. She was compelled to kill men. This was the only way of survival. In fact, there's a time when she's talking vaguely with a Vietnam vet, and he thinks she's talking about prostitution, but she's really talking about murdering men on the street. And he's saying, they'll never understand circumstance. That's what people who aren't in our situation do. And she's like, circumstance? Yeah, exactly. That's why I get to do what I get to do. It's really interesting to me. It almost feels like a confessional after she's been arraigned, after she's been convicted. This movie really disturbed me because of her mindset. Made it impossible for me to completely agree with her at all, which is good. But at the same point, to think that she could be tortured in the way that she was, not by other people, but by herself. This is a love story like Charles Starkweather in Badlands. You've got Selby basically as Sissy Spacek, and it is a really disturbing story.
Well, what's really interesting is that nowadays, and I think with the advent of the internet and social media, that there now is a very large community of female horror fans, which didn't really exist before. Of
All
course,
hail.
of course, there were female horror fans, but it certainly didn't seem like they were as big of a community as they are now. When I was growing up, and especially probably even more so when you were growing up. But now if you go on Twitter and stuff, there's a lot of young female horror fans. And what's interesting is that with the it seems to have really reared its head with this Wonder Woman movie, which is interesting because it's directed by the same woman that directed Monsters. All these female horror movie fans and horror fans are becoming obviously very pro woman, very there's a lot of feminism going on with film fans now that are female. And with horror fans, these female fans are starting to now look back at these movies and starting to question like gender in horror.
Right.
And, because for so long they were made by guys, kind of for guys. And even when you had strong female characters like the final girls, often they were saved by a male at the end, with few exceptions, like Susie Bannion in Suspiria, is certainly one that she's the protagonist, she's the hero, and she's with her own strength, she saves herself through that crazy ordeal. But part of that also comes from the fact that female killers, and especially serial killers, are a very rare thing in real life. Right. So watching this movie now, it spoke to me in a different way, because seeing all these conversations happening on social media and female horror fans that are also now writing for websites and stuff, starting to now examine and question the way females have always been presented, and the idea of like the female monster being rare in comparison to all these male monsters, especially like we're talking about today. So I think for me, it was just an interesting viewing and put in this context to see a female killer amongst all these men with these films that we're examining today.
Yeah, that's kind of why I wanted to put it in here. I was going, it's extremely rare to see a female serial killer. We had one in real life, and it's extremely rare to see a movie where you have a character like this. And how are they going to handle it? And so it's really interesting to see where this movie goes, and how it's reminding me of, I watched the movie XX. It's an anthology horror movie directed by women, and one of the stories is taking Jack Ketchum's The Box, very short story that he did, but very well liked. And all they did was change the gender. None of the dialogue was different. They just changed the main narrator from being the husband to the mother, having the mother be in the main role, and having the father be the supportive person. And everything else was the same, but your feelings about them were completely different. And I started to realize that I was reading by gender how this person should be responding to the problems. Why is she not taking this kid to the doctor? Well, the father wasn't going to take him to the doctor. It didn't bother me. When he said that he felt alone with his family, it was like, poor guy, he's isolated. With her, she's ice. I didn't even realize I was doing until it was put right in my face. And so in watching this, I was like going, how different is her monologues from the crazy monologues that you get with Travis Bickle or from the characters in Cold Blood? I think that it's a really interesting movie because it allows you to think either way, that it's either kind of stilted towards women, or you're in the mind of a serial killer who will lie about anything. Did she really nearly get taken out by a serial killer in the very beginning? We don't know. The very last thing that she says in the movie is she gives a ton of platitudes. If you work hard, things will work out for you. All you need in the world is love. And then she goes, well, they got to tell you something. And I couldn't help but feel that in this movie, she's kind of doing that with us as well. Like, it was really disturbing to me the way that she kills the last John, who if she's telling the truth in her narration, she didn't want to kill, but she needed to kill because she just couldn't let him go. And that was really affecting to me when I had seen, far worse in the movies that I had already watched just for this. But it really interested me that we had this monster that was female. Did I still sympathize with her?
Yeah. Well, definitely. I mean, I think you're right. Earlier you said that, this trauma was kind of self-inflicted. I mean, she's kind of starts this killing rampage through self-defense, really.
Right.
Which is certainly different than the other characters that we're kind of looking at. But the kind of compulsion comes with this kind of like newly realized empowerment that she has because she did it already. I don't know. It was an interesting viewing. I mean, full disclosure, I actually have never. This was my first viewing of this movie, so this was the first time I've seen it.
Huh? What did you feel when you saw it?
I liked it. I mean, I mean, clearly Charlize Theron gives a really great performance in it. It's always nice to see Bruce Dern.
Oh yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I don't have any hugely strong feelings about it other than that I thought it was a well constructed movie and one that certainly lives up to the other movies that we're talking about right now. It seemed like it was a good fit both in the story and the character, but also in kind of the cinematic language and the filmmaking.
Yeah, I think what's interesting to me about it is how she is kind of justifying where she's going as she's going. And she seems to be okay with it until something happens, like Selby gets into a car accident, and then she realizes they're in the car of a murdered man on somebody's yard, and it's like, get out of the car and run. And her justification is really interesting. At one point, she's just killed somebody, and she's saying it's always been the harmless stuff that hurt the most. Whereas a thing so horrible you can't even imagine, that's usually a lot easier to do than you think. And it pulls back, and she's naked in front of the mirror, covered in the person's blood. And she basically says that she can discipline herself into doing anything. In a weird way, she starts to go down. She becomes the guy that attacked her in the very beginning, where he's saying, I hate hookers. And I thought that was a really disturbing scene because she, right before that scene, had said how she could read guys. She knew exactly what their kinks were. So when she gets in the car and he starts taking her into the woods, she already knows what's going to happen. She has a very good indication she's going to get roughed up. She probably doesn't know that he's probably going to hacksaw her up, but she knows she's going to get roughed up, and her performance says that. There's a real weirdness, aloofness to how she is. But by the time she's at her third killing, it's with the stuttering guy. She's immediately pigeonholing him. I'll bet you like to beat people up. I'll bet you like to get really rough in the back. And he finally breaks down. And he's like, no, I don't like the rough stuff. I've never done this before. And she's so upset that he is not following that line of logic that allows her to continue to do this. And it really got interesting towards the end where and this is where, is it her narration? Is this whole thing what she thinks of herself? Because she's almost like doing a selfless act, allowing Selby to get away. Yet she's the one who did all the killings. Now Selby, Selby is an idiot and probably knew. I think at one point they're talking and she says, "Listen, I know what I'm doing. You're never going to be able to understand it. You're just going to have to trust me." And she's like, "Well, wait a second. I don't think that you can kill people." And she goes, "Says who?" And she's like, "I'm good with the Lord. I'm fine with him. God says thou shalt not kill, but that's not the way it works in the world. I wish I could have kept you hidden from that." As if she's like Mildred Pierce all of a sudden. And it's such a bizarre thing. It all feels like an act by the end. And I think that's why this movie hits me as a wily performance. It's there to kind of get your blood boiling a little bit.
Agreed.
All right. Well, that's the 6 movies that we decided to tirelessly go crazy on. I thank you so much for giving me your time, Blake. Do you have any last words on this subject that we've been talking about, sympathetic monsters, that you want to bring up?
One thing I will say, and it was another kind of refreshing thing about Monster, is it seems that the idea of this sympathetic monster topic that we're talking about seems to be something that doesn't happen a whole lot in cinema anymore.
Yeah.
We have like the Hannibal Lecters now, and even though, even with like Seven with Kevin Spacey's spiel at the end, like we kind of see where he's coming from, but we don't necessarily sympathize with him. So it was kind of interesting to see a movie that came out in the 2000s where we are kind of asked to sympathize with her. I think for me as a viewer, I definitely began to lose sympathy for her by the end of the movie.
Right. Yeah.
But I was, I was with her for the first 2/3 or 3/4. But it's a topic that it's interesting to me that seems to have been tackled much earlier in cinema. And in the 60s, obviously at Peeping Tom, but then we have not necessarily a serial killer movie, but another movie that I love a lot, and I know the one that you've discussed on Wrong Rail, Repulsion. Mm-hmm. And then even a movie like The Collector.
Right. Excellent.
Terrence Stamp. It's a kind of this wave of these kinds of things. And
do you think it's a sign of the times? I mean, I think you need to have a certain level of moral ambiguity to allow for the sympathy for the monster in these. Now, you talked about an earlier version of that, Frankenstein. Obviously, that's a different type of sympathy where you're not necessarily sure that someone is the monster. But I'm wondering if we might be rolling back into that time period. A movie that's not a horror movie, but made me think of this as well, was Hell or High Water, which is basically Bonnie and Clyde with two guys. It's got the same kind of setup. It has the same kind of corruption of the government and the lawmen, and it has the same kind of thing where the farmers are kind of enjoying these Robin Hoods for a little bit until it gets a little bit crazy. And it takes a certain level of moral ambiguity and anger to be able to root for Bonnie and Clyde. And so I'm wondering if we're heading back into that time period now.
Very well could be. The other thing that's interesting about these movies is how much like the media plays into it, and into all of these, like the news and newspapers, and the idea of even Peter Lorre's character writing the newspaper because the police won't do anything about it. Of course, that kind of stuff goes back to
Jack the Ripper.
Yeah, Jack the Ripper. But it seems that in all except for maybe Martin, it seems like the media is a very big part of these movies as well. Maniac, he's watching the news and he's reading the newspaper. Obviously the whole ending about Taxi Driver with the newspaper clippings. In a way, a lot of these movies seem to be about like sensationalizing these characters.
Monster, she has clippings. In fact, that's how you find out how many deaths there's been. Either that or there's a new car in the driveway. She killed somebody else.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for taking the time to be able to talk about this as you did. And I had a great time doing it. Can you tell listeners where they can find your book and where they can find your podcast and where they can find you?
Oh, sure. Scored to Death, Conversations with Some of Horror's Greatest Composers. You can find it on Amazon, barnesandnoble.com, and if you have a local bookstore that you enjoy, if bookstores still exist, you can certainly go there and they can order it if they don't have it. I will ask that if you have read it, it would be a great help if maybe you gave me a customer review on Amazon. And I am on Twitter at Scored to Death, and also at Facebook at Scored to Death. I'm at the process of occasionally going out to horror conventions and getting a table and selling and signing the book, and also selling vinyl soundtracks. Ooh. And so you can find out about those things, those appearances, by following me on social media. And then, of course, there's Saturday Night Movie Sleepovers, which is at SaturdayNightMovieSleepovers.com or at Sat Sleepovers on Twitter. We also have a pretty lively Facebook community where we talk and chat with other sleepover movie fans. And you can listen to our podcast on iTunes and Stitcher and basically most podcast distributor websites.
Fantastic. And I want to thank everyone for listening to the show. There will be more episodes of Hellbent for Horror coming soon. And until next time, stay hellbent. And thanks for listening to the show. Hellbent for Horror was written and broadcast by me, S.A. Bradley, and produced by me and Lee Sikorsky. You can find more on our website, hellbentforhorror.com, and I'm also on Facebook at facebook.com/Hellbent for Horror, and my Twitter handle is Hellbent Horror. You can find Hellbent for Horror on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher, and other podcast platforms. And H4H has its own app. You can download it from the Google or Amazon store for Android, and the iPhone version is available on the iTunes store. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay hellbent.